known as responsive consciousness. That's only including sensations, feelings, volitions, apperceptions, and just ideas. Wundt's students, now here's where it got really deep. It was Wundt's students also became eminent psychologists the world over, who included the American James McKean Cattell, who was the first professor of psychology in the United States. It also was George Stanley Hall. He was also a student of Wundt, and he was considered the father of child psychology and adolescent development, and he headed Clark University. There was also Hugo Munsterberg, who contributed to the development of industrial psychology and taught at Harvard University. There was also Edward Bradford Titchener, who founded the first psychology lab in the United States at Cornell University. Also Edward Spearman, who developed the two-factor theory of intelligence. And, of course, there was Ivan Pavlov, the one who was set up the animal behavioral or studied behavioral psychology. And he set his lab up 5 years after Wundt had set his lab up at Leipzig, in Leipzig University. So all in all, Wundt established his neo-psychology as a study of the brain and central nervous system and not the fundamental functioning of the metaphysical mind. And thus from Wundt's works was promoted almost devotedly and fanatically by his students. It was only a short time, only a short step between him now redefining what psychology was and redefining the meaning of education. Here's where we step into our realm. With all of that, you understanding about what Wundt was doing and how they twisted what it meant, here's where we start getting into how the education system had its foundation, what it was before this and what it became. Now, we have to remember that originally education meant, right, the coaxing out and nurturing of a person's innate abilities and gifts or talents by exposing them to knowledge from the different sectors of life through the nuances of language, scientific reasoning, logic, history, literature, mathematics, rhetoric, etc., etc. And once these foundational disciplines were installed in the young mind, they represented a root schematic that the cosmic mind within them would use as tools to express innate abilities possessed by the individual soul, which would flourish and be nurtured and then be used to serve the greater good of humanity. But to the Wundtian experimental psychologists, education became the process of exposing the student to pre-screened, pre-approved, and pre-selected experiences that would ensure the desired reactions and outcomes that conformed to the wishes and dictates of the parasitic elite and the state apparatus that they created. Now, Wundt had stated in his book, and this book is what all people who study psychology have to read in their own in college. It's called Experimental Psychology, and here's what he said. Learning is the result of modifiability. I'm sorry, let me repeat that. Learning is the result of modifiability in the paths of neural conduction. The situation response formula is adequate to cover learning of any sort. And the really influential factors in learning is readiness of the neurons, 2, sequence in time, 3, belongingness, and 4, satisfactory sequence or consequence and outcome. So education no longer now was going to be about helping the internal dynamic of the individual to flourish. It was about programming. So, according to the Western Wundtian psychologists who founded the U.S. public education system, since there is nothing there to begin with but a hollow body, an anatomical husk with just a brain and a nervous system, the way to educate a child by inducing them was just to induce sensations in this blank nervous system. In other words, teach them how to respond to authority and to authority only, or to what you want them to be programmed to have a reactive mind for. Through these experiences, the individual would learn to merely respond to a given formula stimulus in order to induce the appropriate or correct response. This teaching modality was picked up and forwarded by American behavioral psychologists Watson and Skinner. not only did it affect the perception of education, but birthed the catalog of degrees in education called bachelor's degree, master's degree, and the Doctor of Philosophy, or the PhD. In fact, the PhD is a German invention for the credentializing of a system of indoctrination that became known as the Prussian education system. Now, the founders of this Germanic education system here in America were such notables as Elizabeth R. Dodd, Peabody, Carnegie, Rockefeller, Stiller, all the names that you see on PBS who fund PBS. So, it was they who introduced the three-tiered public education system, usurped the private education system that had the IQ of America hovering in the 1800s, the early 1800s, at above 145.
Mm-hmm.
But by the destruction of our own private education system with the imposition of the Russian system, this paved the way for what is now being taught to our children under the mind-stultifying, intelligence-minimizing system called outcome-based education. Now, this is again, I'm wrapping up my my introduction so that we can get more deeply now into the mechanics of the lockdown. In the beginning, the United States education system, what we call a system, was not a system. It was actually a kind of sporadic private thing where everybody came to the education of their own volition. Everyone who had a school did their best to outdo the other school. There was a competition. Our school had the better marks, turned out the better people for the society. So there was a competition to make sure excellence of education and a broad-based understanding of what the world was about was given to all students. In fact, black people at that time had a higher grade point percentage average than white people do today taking PhDs. And
yes,
this
sir.
is the craziness right there. During the 1800s, going after the Civil War, going through the Civil War after 1865, going through 1896 to 1898, during that time, that's when the IQ of the country rose significantly on the private education system. But with the introduction of industrialization, the Carnegies, the Rockefellers, and so forth, they wanted people to assume positions on an assembly line. So you couldn't have educated people just putting a cog in all day. That would not be something that people who were educated would want to do. So the system of dumbing down education into the three-tiered system in Prussia, or what Prussia is actually Germany, was that the bottom 95% would be given this outcome-based kind of education, which was to dumb them down so that they could not become critical thinkers. And the top 4% would then become their authority. Those would be the managers, the administrators, the lawyers, the doctors, the professional class. That would be between them and the 1% who would be given the true education of how to manage the world, give the depth to understand 3, 4, and 5 levels of critical thinking. And with that now, we see why our children, especially our young males being into critical thinking, being into having to challenge, to debate, to get into a kind of confrontational thing of intellect, that's why they dropped out. And were dropping out to the tune of 61% over the last 10 to 15 years. The education system was purposefully destroyed in order to undermine the overall, the collective intelligence index of the United States of America so that it can be conquered or so that it could be more efficiently ruled. And with that, I would now turn it over to you.
Welcome. That Phil Valentine Show. I'm changing the name of the show today, sir. This is the Dr. Phil Valentine show today. The brother's dropping mad science on us, and I'm just actually just overfilled. I feel as a student. So actually, I'm going to hand it back over to you, Brother Valentine, and let me get back into student mode. And if I have a question, I'll just jump in.
Okay. Well, this three-tiered system, they figured out how to achieve the desired result, and this is how this is now taught to our children under the mind game of outcome-based education, and we knew what that was about. It was a system that was given to what is known as the Volksschulen, the folk school or the people school. Okay, this method would be then tailored to divide whole ideas, and this is the secret behind the Prussian system. The Prussian system, where